In the hush of a boardroom, a man's voice pierces the quiet, steady yet quivering, as he surrenders an empire for a truth too heavy to deny. Under the warm light of a new home, a girl, barely 7, holds a letter, her voice rising to weave a family's salvation. In a courtroom taut with hope, a mother, scarred by loss, embraces her daughter, tears falling as justice bends their way. In a park's gentle breeze, a man watches a child laugh, his heart murmuring a name he thought lost forever. Can a single letter rewrite a life? Can a man who sold his soul summon the courage to reclaim it? Stay with us, for this story will reshape what redemption means. The Chicago sun burned down on a cracked apartment lot, its heat pressing against Sophie's skin as she knelt beside a rusted bicycle. At 7, she was a flicker of defiance in a world that dimmed dreams, her t-shirt patched, her ponytail swaying. Her small hands gripped a wrench, cold from the metal's bite, tightening a bolt with a focus no child should need. Grease smeared her cheeks, the bike's chain dangling, a symbol of defeat she refused to accept. The air carried motor oil's sharp tang, mingled with the sour rot of garbage bins. Nearby, Anna, her mother, slumped in a plastic chair, her face hollow, eyes fixed on a crumpled job rejection letter. 6 months without work had drained her spirit, leaving a ghost where hope once stood. James stepped from his Audi, the sun's glare stinging his skin, his briefcase heavy with a foreclosure notice. Sophie's wrench clanked, a steady rhythm cutting through the courtyard stillness, drawing his gaze. He'd come to serve the notice, a routine task for a man who turned lives into ledgers for profit. His phone buzzed, Richard's text a prod 3B due today. Suri, board's watching? Close it. The company was his master, Richard its voice, and this deal worth $2 million was another brick in his empire. But Sophie's quiet resolve, her hands battling the bike, stirred something he hadn't felt in years. He approached, the notice crisp in his hand, ready to hand it over. This was business, nothing more. But Sophie looked up, her gray eyes slicing through him, steady and unyielding, a mirror to a man he'd buried. His hand froze, the notice half raised, his breath catching. This wasn't just hardship, it was a theft, a childhood stolen by a system he served. Some debts are paid in tears, not dollars. Anna's head lifted, her eyes narrowing with contempt. Another suit, she muttered, her voice venomous. What's left to take Sophie tilted her head, her voice soft but sharp. You're here for Mom, aren't you? The words landed like stones, their quiet scorn a cut deeper than tears. James's lips pressed tight, his pulse quickening. I'm Mr. Carter, he said, his voice calmer than he felt, the notice still unoffered. Sophie set the wrench down, its clank a verdict on the concrete. She wiped sweat from her brow, leaving a grease streak, and stepped closer. Mom says we'll find a way, she said, her words a shield against a world that broke promises. Anna's gaze burned, daring him to act. The heat closed in, the notice's edges sharp against his fingers. Richard's text a chain pulling him back to duty. He'd closed countless deals, left families in ruins, but Sophie's eyes, Ethan's eyes, a boy lost a decade ago, held him captive. His hand lowered, the notice untouched, his resolve cracking. He'd come to take, but her defiance, her small hands fighting, was a truth he couldn't face. His phone buzzed again, Richard's impatience a roar, but James turned, his steps heavy. Sophie's gaze followed, a question he couldn't answer. He reached his car, the notice slipping from his hand to the passenger seat, a silent surrender. Choices made in silence can shatter empires. The city pulsed on, but for James, a shift had sparked, fragile but undeniable. The glow of a computer screen lit James's office, its hum a restless pulse in the quiet. Sophie's voice will fix it, echoed from the courtyard, a splinter in his mind as he stared at the foreclosure notice on his desk. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Richard's email, glaring 3B status. Close it or I take your place. Richard, hungry for a promotion through this $2 million deal, was a leash James had worn too long. He began typing a reply, ready to sign the notice and end Sophie's fight. his routine as a debt collector steadying his hand. But a faded box in his drawer, untouched for years, caught his eye, and his fingers stilled. James was a man alone, his wealth a cold comfort in a penthouse he barely called home. Divorced, childless by fate, he'd built an empire buying bad debts families like Sophie's and selling their ruins for profit. Each deal was a wall against Ethan, his 8-year-old son, lost a decade ago when a stray dog lured him into a street. James had been on a call, sealing a merger, his ambition drowning out the nanny's scream. The tire's screech haunted his nights, a sound that erased Ethan's laughter. He'd buried his son on a frozen morning, his heart with him, and work became his only pulse. He opened the box, his hand trembling, pulling out a photo of Ethan, soccer ball under his arm, grin bright as summer. His heart sank, shame surging as Sophie's face, her hands on that bike, merged with his son's. Why did she fight when the world offered nothing? His phone buzzed. Richard's text, "A whipboard's waiting. Don't choke." The deal was Richard's ticket to the top, and James was his tool. The email cursor blinked, his reply half-written, but Ethan's smile stopped him. A mirror to a failure he couldn't outrun. Some wounds bleed in silence, but they shape every choice. In her small bedroom, Sophie sat on a creaky mattress, a flashlight casting shadows on her notebook. At 7, she wove hope with words, her t-shirt smudged, her brow furrowed as she wrote, "Dear stranger, I want a house with a garden." Mom's sad, but words can fix things. Her pencil scratched softly, her hand steady despite the day's weight, her gray eyes burning with resolve. She was a child carrying a family's faith, a spark in a home dulled by loss. The air held the faint scent of ink, her letter a vow against despair. Anna lay in the next room, her breath uneven. A job rejection letter crumpled beside her. 6 months without work had left her a shell, a mother whose fight had faded but whose daughter refused to break. Sophie folded her letter, her gaze unwavering, and taped it to the wall beside another, "Words can change things." The paper rustled, a small rebellion in a world that offered no mercy. She sank into her pillow, her heart clinging to a dream she wouldn't surrender. James stood, Ethan's photo in his hand, the email unfinished. Richard's ambition, the board's greed, they were chains he'd forged himself. He could sign the notice, keep his place, let Sophie fade into numbers. But her strength, her hands on that wrench, was a call he couldn't ignore. His fingers tore a corner of the notice, the rip a quiet defiance, its sound sharper than the phone's buzz. He set the photo on the desk, Ethan's grin a challenge he couldn't dodge. The city's deals churned beyond the glass, but a spark had ignited, fragile but real. Sophie tucked her notebook away, her eyes tracing the letter on the wall. Anna muttered in her sleep, a plea for one more day, but Sophie stayed silent, her hope a beacon in the dark. James sat back, the torn notice beside him, Richard's email unanswered. He'd built a life on profit, but Sophie's fight, Ethan's memory, was a truth he couldn't bury. The past you hide shapes the future you fear. James closed the box, the notice's torn edge a vow he hadn't spoken, a step toward a man he might still become. Richard's polished shoes clicked across the office floor, each step a warning shot in the sterile quiet. His email burned on James's screen, 3B due now. Close it, or I take your spot. At 45, Richard saw the $2 million deal as his ladder to the boardroom's top, and James was his stepping stone. The foreclosure notice lay on the desk, a crisp blade ready to cut Sophie's home. James's hand paused over the pen, ready to sign, to end the girl's fight and secure his place. But his phone lit up. Ethan's photo, his son, lost a decade ago, flashing as the screensaver, and his breath faltered. James was the company's enforcer, a man who turned families into figures for profit. Sophie's gray eyes, fierce in the courtyard, had cracked that role, but Richard's ambition was a chain he'd worn too long. He'd built his life on deals like this, each one a shield against the memory of Ethan, killed chasing a dog while James chased a merger. The tire's screech still echoed, a scar no contract could cover. Richard's text followed, 48 hours, Carter. Don't choke. The board was watching, And Richard's promotion hung on this deal. James gripped the pen, his eyes narrowed, ready to sign. But Ethan's grin, Sophie's resolve, stopped him cold. Some battles are fought in silence, but they scar the deepest. In a small park near the Chicago complex, Sophie knelt in the grass, her small hands stuffing litter into a trash bag. At 7, she moved with a quiet strength, her t-shirt smudged, her ponytail bouncing. "If I keep it clean, maybe we stay," she whispered, her gray eyes bright with a hope that stung to see. The air carried the fresh scent of mown grass, the swings creaking in the breeze. Anna sat on a bench, her face gaunt, a job rejection letter folded in her lap. Her voice was bitter as James approached, his suit stark against the park's worn edges. She said, rising, her eyes blazing. "Suits like you always come out on top, don't they? Take it all and leave." The words hit like a lash, true and raw, a microaggression that pinned James. Sophie glanced up, her gaze cautious, her hands clutching the bag. "Is he taking our park too?" she asked, her voice small but pointed, a cut that sank deep. James's shame pressed heavy, the notice in his pocket a weight he couldn't lift. He'd come to check, to face the girl who'd shaken him, but Anna's scorn, Sophie's question, were a mirror to his failure. "I'm Mr. Carter," he said, his voice quieter than he meant, the notice unoffered. Sophie stood, brushing grass from her knees, her eyes searching his. "Mom says we'll find a way," she said, her words a fragile armor. Anna's laugh was hollow. "Find a way with what you take everything." Her gaze dared him to act, a challenge James couldn't meet. His phone buzzed, Richard's name a reminder of the ticking clock. The deal. Richard's climb, they were a machine James had fed for years. He'd signed notices like this, left lives in ruins. But Sophie's eyes, so like Ethan's, held him fast. He saw his son in her, the boy he'd failed, and the shame was a wall he couldn't scale. "You have until tomorrow," he said, his voice breaking, the notice untouched. James turned, Sophie's gaze trailing him, Anna's sneer a shadow at his back. In his office, he sat, the notice before him, Richard's email a roar in his ears. He'd won countless deals, but this felt like surrender. Sophie's hands, Anna's truth, they were wounds he couldn't close. He slid the notice into a drawer, the woods thud a quiet vow, his hands steady despite the storm. Victories built on ruin leave only scars. The park's swings creaked in his mind. Sophie's hope a light he couldn't extinguish, a spark that burned beyond the city's deals. The penthouse's stillness pressed heavy, broken only by the faint scratch of James's pen. Richard's email glowed on his laptop. 3B closes tomorrow, Carter. My board seat's on this. Don't fail. Sophie's image, her hands clutching a trash bag in the park, flickered in his mind, a light he couldn't snuff out. The foreclosure notice lay before him, crisp and cold, a tool to end her fight and seal the $2 million deal. James's fingers hesitated, the pen poised to sign, his name half formed on the paper. A wooden box in his desk caught his gaze, its lid ajar, a child's scrawl peeking out, and his breath faltered. James was a solitary figure, his wealth a hollow shield in a home of glass and steel. He'd forged an empire turning families into figures, each deal a wall against Ethan. His son, lost a decade ago to a street's cruel chance, while James chased profit. The tire's screech echoed, a scar no ledger could erase. Richard's text buzzed 48 hours, or you're done. The deal was Richard's path to the board, James his instrument. He opened the box, pulling out a letter from Ethan, written at 8 Dad. Let's play soccer soon. Shame flared, Sophie's defiance blending with his son's hope, a truth he couldn't bury. Silence isn't empty, it's where truth fights to be heard. In the complex's library, Sophie knelt by a metal box of letters, its hinges creaking in the dim glow of a lamp. At 7, she battled despair with words, her t-shirt loose, her brow knit as she sifted through papers. She found her old journal, her hand pausing on a page. I dreamed of a boy with a ball. He said, don't stop. Her breath steadied, the dream Ethan's face, a park alive with joy still sharp. Her gray eyes shone, believing dreams were signs. Her words a bridge to hope. The air held the musty tang of old books. Her journal a vow against a fading world. Anna slept in their apartment. A job rejection letter crumpled beside her. Her despair a storm Sophie faced alone. The girl opened her journal, her pencil racing. The boy said, "Keep going." She pinned the page to the bulletin board, its rustle a quiet defiance, her heart clinging to a dream she wouldn't yield. She sat back, her small frame steady in the chair, her faith a spark in the library's hush. James stood, Ethan's letter in his grip, the notice half signed. Richard's greed, the board's demands, they were shackles he'd worn too long. He could finish the signature, erase Sophie, keep his place. But her strength, her hands on that bag, was a call he couldn't dodge. His fingers tore a corner of the notice, holding it over a lighter's flame. The paper curled, its ash falling like a vow, the fire's crackle sharper than Richard's threats. He folded Ethan's letter, setting it beside the charred remains, his resolve a light in the dark. Sophie closed her journal, her eyes tracing the pinned page. Anna's murmur, a plea for one more day, drifted from their apartment. But Sophie stayed silent, her hope a beacon in the quiet. She taped another page to the board, her hand firm, her belief unshaken. The library's stillness held her vow, a promise to a world that could bend. James sat, the notice's ash a quiet rebellion, Ethan's letter a weight he chose to bear. He could have signed, served Richard's ambition, stayed in the machine. But Sophie's fight, Ethan's hope, were a truth he wouldn't betray. He swept the ash into the bin, the notice's ruin a promise unspoken. The city's deals churned beyond the glass, but a shift had ignited, fragile yet fierce. The spark of defiance flickered in the dark. James held Ethan's letter, Sophie's face in his mind, a path he'd tread despite the cost. A flickering bulb buzzed in the narrow hallway of the Chicago complex, its dim light casting shadows on Sophie's small frame. She stood by a peeling wall, her t-shirt loose, her backpack slung over one shoulder. At 7, she was a flicker of hope in a world that dimmed it, her gray eyes scanning the corridor. James approached, his suit stark, the foreclosure notice in his hand, his pen poised to sign. Richard's text burned in his pocket, 3B now, Carter. My promotion's riding on this. James's gaze faltered. Sophie's resolve from the park, a girl who wouldn't break stirring a doubt he couldn't shake. He raised the pen, ready to end her fight, but Sophie's voice stopped him. I've got something, she said, her tone soft but firm, her hand digging into her backpack. She pulled out a folded letter, its edges worn, her fingers clutching the strap as she held it out. James's breath hitched, his pen hovering, the notice unsigned. Anna leaned against the wall, her face etched with distrust, a job rejection letter tucked in her coat. You again, she muttered, her voice sharp. Come to finish us off, her words stung, a quiet scorn that pinned James. Sophie stepped closer, her eyes steady. It's for someone who'll listen, she said, offering the letter, her hope a fragile bridge. James took it, his fingers froze, the faint scent of pencil lead rising from the page. He unfolded it, Sophie's words spilling out, Dear stranger, I met a boy at a fair. He gave me candy and said to keep smiling. I don't stop because of him. His heart clenched, the memory surging Ethan, a decade ago, dancing through a charity fair, candies in hand, his laughter bright. Dad, they're so happy, James's gaze faltered, Sophie's face merging with his son's. A light he'd failed but wouldn't again. Some truths arrive quietly, but they change everything. Sophie watched, her head tilted, unaware of the storm she'd sparked. Do you think he's still out there? She asked, her voice a whisper, her faith piercing the hallway's gloom. Anna's eyes narrowed but softened, sensing a shift. What's that letter, she asked, stepping forward, her tone cautious. James couldn't answer, his hand gripping the paper, the notice forgotten. Richard's text buzzed again, his ambition a boardroom promotion clawing at James. But Sophie's words, Ethan's memory, held him fast. He'd come to sign, to serve the machine. But this girl, this letter, was a chance he couldn't lose. I'll make this right, he said, his voice rough, folding the letter with care. He met Sophie's eyes, her smile shy but fierce, a spark that broke his walls. Keep writing, he said, his words a vow. Sophie nodded, her hand clutching her backpack strap, her trust more than he deserved. Anna's arms uncrossed, her gaze torn between doubt and hope, a mother yielding to her daughter's faith. James turned, the notice tucked into his pocket, his steps resolute as he pulled out his phone. In his car, James dialed a lawyer, his voice steady, the notice abandoned. Richard's threats flashed on his screen, but he ignored them. Ethan's candy vivid. Sophie's hope a fire he'd guard. He wasn't running anymore. In the complex library, Sophie sat at a table, her journal open, her pencil racing. The man in the suit will help. I know it. Her smile was radiant, a light Anna didn't see as she dozed, worn by loss. The air held the soft rustle of pages. Sophie's words a promise to a world that could change. James gripped the letter, his resolve unshaken, the lawyer's voice a plan taking shape. He'd fight for Sophie, for Ethan's memory, a second chance he wouldn't waste. The city's pulse roared beyond the windshield, but a new path had opened, tender but true. A single truth can spark a new beginning. James tucked the letter away, the notice forgotten. His call to the lawyer a vow he'd keep, a step toward a man he might yet become. Richard's cigarette smoke coiled in the law office, its bitter sting biting Sophie's eyes as she sat, small and silent, in a creaky chair. At 7, she gripped her notebook, her t-shirt smudged, her gray gaze fixed on the floor. Anna stood, her voice sharp, arguing with a lawyer about their home's debt. Richard's growl sliced through, papers slamming on the desk. You're done, he said, looming over Anna. Leave by tomorrow, or I'll make sure you're homeless. His suit gleamed, his eyes cold. The $2 million deal, his ticket to a boardroom promotion driving his threat. Sophie's shoulders stiffened, her hope a fragile spark against his venom. Anna's hands trembled, her defiance cracking. You can't scare us, she said, her voice faltering, a mother shielding her child from a storm. Richard's smirk was a knife, his fingers jabbing at Sophie. Pack her toys and go, he said, tossing a file to the floor, its pages scattering. The air grew thick, the lawyer's pen scratching in the tense quiet. Anna stepped forward, her eyes blazing, but her strength was a thread stretched thin. Sophie's hands tightened on her notebook, her heart a quiet drum, refusing to break under the man who saw her as nothing. James pushed through the door. His pulse raced at the sight Sophie's stillness. Anna's stand, Richard's cruelty, Sophie's letter, Ethan's memory, burned in his pocket, a vow he'd made to protect her. Richard turned, his eyes narrowing. Carter, you're late, he said, his cigarette glowing. Tell them to leave, man, or the deal's dead. My promotion's on this. James's hands tightened, his voice starting low, ready to negotiate. Richard, let's talk this. But Sophie stood, her notebook falling, her hand pulling a letter from her pocket. Read this, she said, her voice steady, thrusting it toward him, a spark that ignited his resolve. James took the letter, his breath catching, its words Ethan's candy, Sophie's hope a fire he couldn't douse. Some lines, once crossed, demand you fight. Enough, he said, his voice a steel blade, cutting through Richard's scorn. You don't threaten a child. This deal's over. Richard's smirk vanished, his face twisting. You're throwing your career away for them, he spat, pointing at Sophie and Anna. They're nothing. Carter. Numbers. James's voice caught, his anger a tide he wouldn't hold. He saw Ethan and Sophie, the son he'd failed, and this time, he'd stand. They're my family, he said, his words raw but firm. Get out. Richard. Now. Suicide. Richard's laugh was brittle, his cigarette dropping, its ember fading on the carpet. The board will end you, he said, his steps faltering as he backed away. The scattered papers a shadow of his bluster. James's gaze locked on Sophie, her small frame resolute. She ran to him, her arms wrapping tight, her voice a whisper. Thank you, Uncle James. The word uncle struck like a vow, a bond he'd honor forever. His hand rested on her back, the letter still in his grip, her trust a light he'd carry. Anna's eyes glistened, her doubt melting. Why risk it all, she asked, her voice soft, stepping closer. James held Sophie's letter, Ethan's memory vivid. I lost someone, he said, his words rough. Not her. Anna nodded, her hand steady. A mother seeing a man beyond the suit. Sophie pulled back, her smile shy but radiant, her gray eyes a warmth that filled the room's chill. James led them out, the letter in his hand, his resolve unshaken. He called the lawyer, his voice firm, arranging their stay at a hotel. In the complex library, Sophie sat alone, her journal open, her pencil racing. Uncle James's family. He stayed. Her words were a promise, a faith that kindness could reshape their world. Anna watched, her heart lighter, a hope she'd thought lost. The air held the soft rustle of pages, Sophie's light unyielding. James stood outside, the city's glow a blur. Richard's threats, the board's wrath, they were storms he'd face. He'd burned his career, but Sophie's embrace, her voice calling uncle, was a treasure no deal could match. Ethan's smile lived in her, a chance he'd guard. To stand for another is to find your own strength. James held the letter, leading Sophie and Anna to safety, a bond forged in a fight he wouldn't abandon. The library's soft hum cradled Sophie, her small frame bent over a metal box of letters, its lid creaking in the quiet. At 7, she was a girl whose words defied despair, her t-shirt loose, her ponytail tight. Her hands sifted through papers. Her gray eyes widened as she pulled out a yellow document, its edges brittle. Mom's deed, she whispered, her voice a spark in the dim light. Anna's murmur drifted from a phone call outside. We can't lose it all. Sophie's pulse quickened, her hope aflame against the threat of losing their home. Her trust in James, the man she called uncle, a vow she held fast. James sat in his office, his laptop open, Richard's email glaring 3B deal must close. Carter, my seat on the board depends on it. He began typing a reply, offering to negotiate with the board to save his place, his fingers steady despite Sophie's letter burning in his pocket. His phone buzzed, a text from Sophie. Come to the library. His hand stilled, the email half-drafted as he stood, drawn by her call. In the library, Sophie met him, her smile shy but fierce, thrusting the deed forward. This says it's ours, she said, her voice sure. The paper proof Anna's family owned their apartment, buried by the company's greed. James scanned the deed, his years as a debt collector sharpening his gaze. The company had hidden this, banking on Anna's despair. His will steadied, Sophie's faith a light he couldn't dim. This is our fight, he said, his words a promise. Sophie's eyes sparkled, her hand clutching her notebook, her trust a beacon. Anna stepped in, her face pale, her voice cautious. Can it work, she asked, her hope fragile. James nodded, the deed a weapon. We'll sue, he said, his resolve a fire kindled by a girl who'd saved him. Power isn't always loud, it's in the truths we dare to speak. In the company's boardroom, James faced a wall of suits, their eyes cold. Richard at the head, his pen slamming down. Carter, you're here to grovel, he said, his voice a hiss, his boardroom power tied to this $2 million deal at stake. The air smelled of ink, the tables gleam reflecting their greed. James stood, the deed in hand, his email unsent. I'm here to stop you, he said, his voice slow, deliberate, silencing the room. He slid the deed forward, its truth a blade. This proves the property's hers. You buried it. We're suing. The board erupted, voices clashing, Richard's face twisting. You're done, Carter, he shouted, his pen skittering across the table. James saw Sophie's face, Ethan's smile, the man he'd failed. I built this on lies, he said, his words cutting through the chaos. I traded lives for profit, but no more. His hand stilled, his company badge, a silver pin gleaming in his palm. I quit, he said, his voice calm, final, dropping the badge on the table, its clink a quiet thunder. The room hushed, his exit a truth they couldn't silence. In the library, Sophie sat cross-legged, her journal open, her pencil racing. Uncle James will win. I know it. Her smile was radiant, her gray eyes bright, warming the room's stillness. Anna joined her, her hands clasped, her faith in justice stirring after years of loss. Sophie pinned a page to the bulletin board. Truth fixes things. Her hand steadied, her heart a vow in a world that tried to break her. James left the boardroom, his tie gone, the deed a promise in his hand. He'd burned his career, but Sophie's trust, Anna's hope, were worth more than any title. He drove to the lawyer's office, the deed ready for battle. Sophie's journal page, pinned in the library, was a light he followed, a vow he'd keep. Truth, once spoken, builds a new path. James held the deed, Sophie's face in his mind, a fight he'd waged for a family he'd found, a man he could become. The courtroom's hush shattered with the judge's gavel, its sharp crack a beacon of justice. Anna stood, her hands clasped, her eyes wide as the verdict echoed, "The property is rightfully yours." Sophie, at 7, gripped her mother's hand, her gray eyes gleaming, her t-shirt fresh for the day. The deed she'd uncovered, proof of her family's claim, had crushed the company's greed. Anna's breath steadied, her face softening with a hope reborn, a mother reclaimed by truth. Sophie glanced at the gallery, seeking James, her uncle, whose quiet fight had carved this victory, a light she trusted beyond the courtroom's walls. James sat in the shadows, his suit unbuttoned, his soul lifted as the judge's words sank in. Sophie's letter, Ethan's memory, had fueled this funding. The lawyer, backing Anna's case, facing his past. The company, Richard's empire, had crumbled under the lawsuit, his promotion dreams dust. James's breath steadied, Anna's grateful nod a silent bond stronger than any deal. Sophie's smile, fierce yet tender, was a path he'd followed, a redemption he hadn't dared hope for. The lawyer's papers rustled, a victory's soft song, but James's thoughts turned to Sophie's dream, a home made real. In the renovated apartment, the scent of fresh paint mingled with the clatter of hammers, a symphony of renewal. The walls shone soft white, floors gleamed, sunlight streaming through new windows, warming Sophie's face. She stood in the living room, a wooden box of letters in her hands, her ponytail neat, her voice clear as she spoke to a gathered crowd, neighbors, workers. James. "Dear Uncle James," she began, opening a letter, her fingers paused, each word a weight that stilled the hammers. "You saved our home. You believed in us." Her gray eyes held steady, a child whose faith had rebuilt a family's world. James leaned against the doorway, his breath steadied, Sophie's words echoing Ethan's laughter, a legacy he'd lost but now reclaimed. He'd poured his savings into the repairs, every beam a step toward atonement. The crowd hushed, the workers' tools silent, their eyes on Sophie, her courage a fire that warmed them all. Anna stood beside her, her hands steady, touching Sophie's shoulder. "You gave us everything," she said to James, her voice thick with gratitude. James nodded, his voice caught, the word family unspoken but alive in the room's quiet glow. He stepped forward, a banner in his hand, unfurling it to reveal Ethan Foundation, a pledge to aid families like Sophie's, a purpose born from loss. The crowd murmured, surprised, expecting only guilt, not this new mission. James's will steadied, his past no longer a chain but a light. Sophie's letter, Ethan's memory, had led him here, a man who'd traded profit for meaning. He hung a framed photo of Ethan on the wall, his son's smile bright, a silent vow to keep fighting. The crowd clapped, their voices warm, but James's gaze stayed on Sophie, her hope a spark that lit his own. In the library later, Sophie sat alone, her journal open, her pencil racing. "Our home is real. Uncle James is forever." She pinned a page to the bulletin board. "Homes are made of love." Her smile was radiant, a child whose words had forged truth. Anna joined her, a job offer in hand, her heart lighter than in years. They walked to the apartment, their laughter mingling with the hum of a home reborn. James lingered. Ethan's photo a gentle presence, his soul lifted by the walls they'd built together. He stepped outside, the city's pulse steady beyond the complex. The company's fall, Richard's lost power, were shadows of a life he'd left behind. He'd surrendered his wealth, but gained a family Sophie's light, Anna's trust, a bond no deal could break. Redemption isn't a moment, it's a choice that echoes. The apartment stood firm, a testament to their fight, a home where hope thrived. Choices that men create homes that endure. James touched Ethan's photo, Sophie's letter in his pocket, his steps forward a promise to keep their light alive. A candle's gentle flicker cast a warm glow across the dining table, catching Sophie's laughter as she flicked a pea at Anna. At 7, she was a burst of light in the renovated apartment, her t-shirt vibrant, her ponytail dancing. Anna, her mother, passed a plate of roast, her smile bright, her eyes free of the shadows that once clung to her. The clink of forks wove through their chatter, a song of a family reborn. James sat among them, his chuckle soft, his soul warmed in a way he hadn't felt since Ethan. This home, this table, was a miracle they'd crafted, a legacy of choices that outshone the city's hum. James had traded his suits for flannel, his penthouse for a simple flat near Sophie and Anna. He guided families through debt as a volunteer for the Ethan Foundation, each case a step toward the man he'd lost. His wealth had built this apartment's new walls, the foundation's mission, but his purpose was richer than any deal. Sophie's letter, read at the unveiling, rested in his pocket, a reminder of the girl who called him uncle and gave him a new dawn. Anna, now a part-time barista, moved with ease. Her laughter and melody James held dear. In a new park, beneath a budding maple, Sophie sat on a blanket, her journal open, her pencil crafting a tale. The air carried the scent of fresh earth, children's shouts a soft hum. She wrote of Ethan, a boy who shared candy and dreams, her gray eyes sparkling with a vision she believed in. He'd love this place, she said. Her hand lingered on the page, her teacher's praise. You could publish fueling her dream. Her story, bound in a handmade book, was a gift for James, a surprise she clutched tight. Back at the apartment, dinner cleared, the candle steady. Sophie stood on a chair, her storybook in hand, her smile eager. I made this for you, she said, handing it to James, her voice clear, a quiet power that hushed the room. She read, her words painting a man lost in darkness, saved by a girl's hope. James listened, his breath warmed, his smile breaking years of grief. Anna's hand brushed his, her eyes softened, Sophie's tale weaving their past into light. Ethan smiled from her words, alive in the home they'd built. James opened the book, his hand steady, finding a drawing Sophie had tucked inside a sketch of their table. 3 figures laughing. For our wall, she said, her eyes searching his. He nodded, his voice rough. Forever, he said, rising to hang the drawing beside Ethan's photo, its frame a vow to their bond. The room glowed, their laughter a light no loss could dim. Sophie's gift, her story, was more than redemption. It was a family he'd never expected, a truth that reshaped his world. In the park the next day, Sophie wrote again, her pencil racing, families are stories we keep. She tucked the page into her journal, her smile radiant, a child whose hope had forged truth. Anna joined her, a picnic basket in hand, their laughter blending with the breeze. James watched from a bench, Ethan's memory a gentle presence, his soul warmed. The quietest choices build the loudest legacies. The apartment stood firm, a home where 3 souls chose to stay, a light no city could quench. The smallest acts forge the strongest homes. James, Sophie, and Anna's story is one of many waiting to stir your heart. Join Unveiled Wealth to sharing stories that build homes from hope. Subscribe now, and let's weave those tales together.